Hey everybody, Plushie here, and I know it's been a while since the last hot take video because my IRL schedule has been a little bit hectic recently, but finally we're back, and of course today we're going to talk about the brand new Valentine servant, Pope Joan, or Popes Johanna, depending on what you want to call her. I'm just going to call her Pope Joan for simplicity's sake. She's definitely an interesting servant, so we're going to evaluate her kit in a couple of different aspects, and so let's get into it. So her first skill is a targetable 3-turn buff that gives the target a 5000% star absorb up on their arts card, a 100% critical damage up on their arts card, and finally a 10 star per turn generation effect. So right off the bat, this is probably her strongest skill in my personal opinion, because this is the strongest arts critical support skill in the entire game. The 100% arts critical damage up for 3 turns combines the biggest number we've seen for arts crit support and the longest duration we've seen, which is Lanling with 50% at 3 turns and Lady Avalon at 100% for 1 turn. Now granted, both of these other effects do apply to other cards, but in an arts team you usually want their arts cards to crit anyways. These arts star absorb up by 5000% is equally or sometimes even more powerful than the critical damage boost, because for arts teams they usually struggle to generate stars, and 5000% very much guarantees even the lowest star weight characters to crit with their arts cards at 100%. This also helps them refund with an arts crit. And finally, the star per turn effect is also especially valuable in arts teams because, once again, arts teams usually struggle to generate stars with their MP and their cards, so having this sort of 20-30 effect is a really nice bonus. The only small gripe is that it is tied to Pope Joan herself instead of the target of the buff, so if Pope Joan somehow leaves the field, you lose this effect. Her second skill is an AoE 20% arts up for 3 turns, an AoE 1-time 3-turn debuff immunity, an AoE 1000 damage cut for 3 turns, and finally a self 30 MP battery. Now, the AoE 20% arts up for 3 turns is something we've seen before recently in a lot of arts AoEs that try to support the team as well, such as Rasputin's skill 2 or Nitocris Alter's skill 3, so it is pretty standard at this point. It's not too high, not too low, serviceable, I suppose. The 1-time 3-turn debuff immunity is also something we've seen previously on Nitocris Alter again, and as I've mentioned in that video, this is particularly good in blocking debuffs that are easily timed, such as debuffs that are applied on MP or debuffs that are applied on break. So it's still a really powerful effect, but you just have to be a little bit mindful when to use it. The 1000 damage cut for 3 turns for the entire team is actually really rare. I'm not sure if we've seen this before in the entire game, because other AoE damage cut effects are usually timed, like hit based. So like Mash's skill or Talaluk's skill, they only have like 1 hit or 3 hit, and for Pope Joan this is just 3 turns, it doesn't have a hit limit. So in the perfect world where the enemy attacks with AoE attacks 3 times every single turn for 3 turns, this can reduce a total of 27,000 damage, which, you know, it's not going to happen 99% of the time, but it shows how this is really good against those kinds of bosses that do consistent AoE damage, like, you know, Cernunnos, Kamazotz, Demonic Bodhisattva, Beast 4L. So really good counter effect. This is also really good on Pope Joan herself in particular, because rulers take half damage from most classes, and the damage calculation calculates the half damage from class advantage first and then the damage cut. So this technically acts as a 2000 damage cut for Pope Joan herself. This can be really powerful against normal classes, and also really powerful for solos. Pope Joan herself overall is not a really good solo servant in my opinion, but this definitely allows her to just not take damage for 3 turns sometimes even. But this, on the flip side, is not very good against enemies that do high single target damage, or just have a really spammable MP in general. And finally, 30 MP battery, always good with arts AoE loopers, pairs well with a maxed out append 2 skill, not as good as 50 MP battery, you got the drill. My small gripe with this skill is the 7-turn cooldown, particularly with the damage cut effect. I really hope it has a higher uptime, because that will give her a lot more solo potential, but as of now I can understand why it is 7, because it does so much in one skill. Finally, her third skill is an AoE buff that gives all allies 20% attack up, and also a slow charge effect that charges them by 20 MP every turn for 3 turns. Now, this is also a very hyped up skill. The charisma is a nice addition to the art sub. Usually for these semi-support AoE art servants, they don't have another effect to buff the team. So with this, she kind of outclasses them in terms of support. But of course, the most juicy effect of this skill is the 20% slow charge for the entire team. Now, this is really good in multi-core farming, especially with multi-core farming teams that include a single target servant, because single target servants usually refund really badly, and having this flat 20% charge is almost always going to be better than a refund increase effect such as MP gain up or just an arts up. But however, you do need to clear a wave with Pope Joan herself to have this be actually worth it though, because one, in a farming context, this actually only happens twice, so it's not a 60% charge, it's only a 40% charge. And if you're doing like, let's say, a purely single target looping setup, it's not going to be better than Castoria or Oberon, right? Because Castoria has 50 charge with increased refund, and Oberon has 70 charge, while Pope Joan has 40 charge with a smaller amount of increased refund with the 20% arts up compared to Castoria. So it is very situational. I think it's only good for like 90++, and Pope Joan can clear like wave 1 or even 2 waves sometimes, but it's still decent. It's really debatable whether this is better or a straight up charge effect like Tezcali Polka. But I guess you'll just have to find out depending on the 90++ node. My gripe with this skill though is the 8-turn cooldown. I don't think this skill in any capacity is worth 8 turns of cooldown. I can kind of understand why skill 2 has 7-turn cooldown. I do not understand why this skill has an 8-turn cooldown. It makes her supportability, really drop if you're using her in a stall team and you expect to use your skills multiple times. This 8-turn cooldown will start to sting really fast. So quite unfortunate. This also makes her solo ability worse because that charisma is tied to this slow charge effect, making its cooldown all the way extend up to 8, which is horrible. Her passives are pretty standard, but also pretty solid. Magic Resistance EX is at the point of being high enough to be noticeable. If you're planning to keeping her on the field for long, this can actually yield you a lot of benefit across long periods of turns. So pretty solid. And also the Territory Creation A, which is always useful on an Arts Looper. 10% Arts up as a passive is really good. And finally, her MP is a 3-hit AoE Arts MP that gives herself a anti-evil power mod by 50% for a single turn. This means that this extends to the face cards chained after her MP. So if you want to do some Arts crit shenanigans with her against an evil enemy, you can. This also inflicts a 1-time 3-turn buff block to all enemies. Now, this is a strictly worse version than Murasaki's infinite times buff block in my personal opinion, but it's still a really solid effect. Once again, this has the similar problem with the debuff immunity where you kind of have to time it against certain buffs, or else the enemy would just use a random buff to eat up the buff block and then use their actual relevant buff that you want to block. But it's still really good. Her MP is spammable, so you can kind of reapply this every single turn. And finally, her overcharge effect is an anti-man damage mod that scales from 150% to 200%, which is the standard for these anti-trait damage. And man is a pretty, common trait, so among servants especially, so in challenge quests this is also going to land pretty often. So she has a combined anti-niche against evil and man, which is really common. Both traits are pretty common, and it's also pretty common to have a servant that contains both traits. So on paper, if she hits both evil and man, her MP is going to dish out massive amounts of damage. However, this is something I should have mentioned earlier. Her attack stat is pretty low and her self-steroid is not high. She's actually not an amazing damage dealer. Her MP does less damage than EO if both are at MP5 and neither of them hit their niche. So it's kind of unfortunate, but yeah. So how do I feel about Pope Joan? Well, she certainly is cute, and she's a pretty complicated servant, so we're gonna break it down into different categories. First of all, we're gonna talk about her farming abilities, because of course she's AoE Arts and we have to get into that. As a single core farmer, her refund on base is a bit low because it is 3 hits, but it is more than made up by her skill 3's 20 static charge effect. It actually makes her less reliant on enemy counts because the 20 charge is not refund dependent. However, her damage is really bad if she doesn't hit either man or evil, and it's actually pretty common for that to happen in farming nodes because when you're not facing against a servant, they're a lot of times not going to have either. You just don't want to use her as an omni farmer because her damage is so bad. Usually you have way better options in other classes. As a multi-core farmer, she's faring a lot better. As I've mentioned before, with her skill 3, she pairs really well with single target servants, where she can clear her own wave and then she can help the other servant also clear multiple waves. And her attack boost at 20% and arts up at 20% combined is actually higher than most other AoE arts that try to support the team, so I like that a lot as well. And she can also help with crit waves if wanted, because her skill 1 is such a bread and butter effect that has everything you want for critical damage. Granted, you usually don't want to crit with arts in a farming composition, but you know, sometimes the occasion might pop up. As challenge quest support, she's really strong. As I mentioned before, her skill 1 is the best arts critical support skill in the entire game, and it enables damage dealers with low star weight in particular to not only do massive amounts of arts crit damage on top of their MP, and also let them refund very consistently and fire off their MP every single turn with their arts critical cards, such as Kriemhild, Summer Heiress. I think these servants benefit massively from the addition of Pope Joan into the game. So in general, if you want to kill the boss quickly with any sort of arts damage dealer, Pope Joan is going to be an invaluable asset to your team. However, I don't think arts critical teams are that necessary of a playstyle compared to buster crits and quick crits, because in general for arts teams you can actually just survive very long. If you miss the kill on the first initial 3 turns where you have your buffs, you can just stall and wait for all your buffs to come back and then use them again and kill the boss. However, it is a tall ask for buster teams involving Korean Light or quick teams in general just to even last 2 extra turns after their initial 3 turns of burst. So I don't think this is a necessary playstyle. As for her other utility, her skill 2 has the damage cut and the debuff immunity, her MP has buff block, and her skill 3 has AoE MP slow charge that can actually go up to 60% in a challenge quest context. It's all really good for stalling. It's not going to be as good for stalling as someone like Lady Avalon or Castoria, but it's a good sort of tech choice, I suppose. Let's say the enemy has, once again, AoE attacks that doesn't do a lot of damage, or enemies that has a crucial debuff or buff that you want to block off. Overall, she has a lot of good utility. However, I do think her cooldown very much holds her back in terms of in a stall team sort of scenario, because you want to have all of their buff effects at high uptime, and a lot of these stall servants have their buff effects mainly focused on their MP, so they can actually have it on very high uptime because you can keep looping their MP. But Pope Joan's effects are all on her skills, and really long cooldown skills at that, so a little bit unfortunate in my personal opinion. As a main DPS, she reminds me a lot of Beniema, where she has a fully supportive skill set, but she has a fully offensive MP effect that has 2 wide coveraging anti-trait damages. So on paper they look like they do both very well, but in reality, because of her low attack stat and her low self-steroid, I actually think she need to hit at least 1 trait to be worth using as a main DPS. The evil part is a little bit easier to solve. You can pair her up with Ruler Moriarty. You can also fix it with Avenger Nitocris to apply evil on all enemies, but I don't know, I just don't see it as powerful as someone like Estrella. Unlike Estrella, whose anti-evil almost feels like a bonus on top of a already solid MP, Pope Joan's anti-evil almost feels like a necessity. And of course she can use her crit skill on herself, but once again, if she's not fighting evil in particular, I think her low attack stat really holds her back. And finally, as a solo unit, of course she has potential with her damage cut against classes that do half damage to her. However, because of the long cooldown with her skill 2 and skill 3, and usually for solos you do want high uptime on your buffs, I think it really holds her back. She also lacks a sustaining effect such as a heal because for solo servants like her who's trying to tank damage consistently, they also want a heal. So someone like Bart Guess would be a good example, but Pope Joan doesn't have any way to reduce her own cooldowns or just heal back after blocking all that damage with her skill 2. So I think she's actually not a really good solo servant. So in conclusion, Pope Joan is a really powerful servant. Her art's critical support skill is unmatched in the entire game, and if you like to min turn or fast clear bosses with your art's DPSs, especially if you own someone like Kriemhild or Summer Eris, you're going to want her and to support your playstyle. But once again, as I've mentioned before, this playstyle is really unnecessary. You can still make your art's single targets work with just Lady Avalon and Castoria. Just take a couple more turns, it's not going to kill you. So it's kind of stuck in a weird position where on paper she's really good as a support, but her support is unnecessary in a lot of ways. On top of that, she can also provide interesting utilities to stall teams that previously do not really exist, but overall she's not going to be more valuable than some of the staples we already have. There are a lot of ways to make her work, I suppose, but she's also not a servant that is just straight up broken, so definitely not a must roll to any capacity in my personal opinion. So anyways, hope you guys enjoy, and good luck on pulling for Pope Joan, and I'll see you guys in the next one.